7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
I'm going to speak about Robert Oppenheimer for 35 or 40 minutes. And after that, would be happy to take questions and comments from any of you who have such. The Manhattan Project is fading into myth. The last of its first-ranked leaders, Hans Bethe, died at Ithaca in 2005. A letter from Einstein to Roosevelt eclipses the British Maud Report. Los Alamos, a laboratory on a mesa surrounded by a wilderness. A small coterie of scientists witching historic transmutations eclipses armies of workers and vast factories at Hanford and Oak Ridge. Hiroshima eclipses Nagasaki, poor Nagasaki, even as the war in Europe with its epic D-Day extravaganza eclipses the longer and crueler Pacific War. And to our point here this evening, Robert Oppenheimer, a century and a decade after his birth on 22 April 1904, has eclipsed General Groves and half a hundred others as the shining talent, the indispensable leader of the project, the Prospero or the Faust of the tragic epic that the story of the first atomic bombs has become. The true history is far otherwise. The Maud Report and 3 successive National Academy of Sciences reports won Franklin Roosevelt's commitment. The first bombs were designed and built at Los Alamos, to be sure, but the armies of workers and the vast factories produced their rare materials. Nagasaki suffered equally with Hiroshima for the Japanese leadership's refusal to surrender. Russian sacrifice, Allied lend-lease, and achieved victory in Europe. But it needed atomic bombs to end the Pacific War. And no one who was part of the Manhattan Project doubted that General Groves was in charge. Nor did the project lack for other colorful characters, larger than life-sized: Bethe, Glenn Seaborg, Edward Teller, Ernest Lawrence, Enrico Fermi, Vannevar Bush, Arthur Compton, Leo Szilard, Harold Urey, Louis Alvarez, Emilio Segre, Eugene Wigner, Crawford Greenewalt, Paul Tibbets, Ken Bainbridge, Isidore Rabi, George Kistiakowsky, Deke Parsons, and of course, Klaus Fuchs, and many others. People, some of whom I knew in person, though I was not so fortunate as to meet Oppenheimer before his early death from throat cancer at 63 in 1967. It's worth asking why one man, Robert Oppenheimer, should emerge from such a rich and crowded field of candidates as the central figure of what is arguably the single most important historic development of the 20th century. It's worth asking as well if his early understanding of the consequences of the explosive release of nuclear energy stands up to the years of history since his time. That Robert Oppenheimer's complexities should be reduced to a mythical unity is ironic. His contemporaries found him various indeed. Tall, thin, handsome, brilliant, with piercing blue eyes, chain smoking, intense, elegant, witty, cruelly dismissive when he chose to be, generous, passionate, idealistic, but also divided within himself. and by his own admission, self-loathing. He seemed different men to different people. Edward Teller told me that Robert Oppenheimer was the finest lab director he had ever known, and I took that assessment seriously. Praise from a man's worst enemy is praise indeed. Hans Bethe told me Oppenheimer was able to direct the effort at Los Alamos so successfully because he was so much smarter than everyone else. And Bethe included himself in that comparison. Bethe also told me, a more telling insight, I think, that Oppenheimer had been casually cruel to people who made mistakes around him, including Bethe, before the war and after the war, but that he suspended the hostilities at Los Alamos. Chester Bernard, president of New Jersey Bell, described Oppenheimer in 1947 as an extraordinary man who worked very hard and always seemed to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. His students and his friends saw him differently from his enemies, of course. To Lewis Strauss, Boris Pash, and William Borden, among others, Oppenheimer was a Machiavellian schemer and a communist spy. To Oppenheimer's enemies in the terrible security hearing they imposed on him that condemned him to internal exile and destroyed him, tough-minded Isidore Rabi had the irrefutable rebuttal. The suspension of the clearance of Dr. Oppenheimer, Rabi told the Gray Board, was a very unfortunate thing and should not have been done against a man who had accomplished what Dr. Oppenheimer had accomplished. There is a real positive record, the way I expressed it to a friend of mine. We have an A-bomb and we have a whole series of super bombs. And what more do you want, mermaids? Rabi knew him well. He was an aesthete, Rabi described Oppenheimer to Bill Moyers. I don't think he was a security risk. I do think he walked along the edge of a precipice. He didn't pay enough attention to the outward symbols. He was a very American person of a certain kind of intellectual, aesthetic person of the upper middle classes. On another occasion, Rabi assessed his friend's personal conflicts and their consequences for his science. I found him excellent, Rabi said. We got along very well. I enjoyed the things about him that some people disliked. It's true that you carried on a charade with him. He lived a charade and you went along with it. It was fun, matching wits and so on. Oppenheimer was great fun, Rabi goes on, and I took him for what he was. I understood his problem. His problem was identity. He reminded me very much of a boyhood friend about whom someone said that he couldn't make up his mind whether to be president of the B'nai B'rith or the Knights of Columbus. Perhaps he really wanted to be both simultaneously. Oppenheimer wanted every experience. In that sense, he never focused. My own feeling, Rabi concludes, is that if he had studied the Talmud in Hebrew rather than Sanskrit, he would have been a much greater physicist. I never ran into anyone who was brighter than he was. But to be more original and profound, I think you have to be more focused. I am certainly not competent to judge if Oppenheimer's science was less original and profound than it might have been. Perhaps Rabi was. But I'd like to look briefly at what I believe to be Oppenheimer's greatest achievement after the bomb itself, an original and profound achievement indeed, and neglected in something of the same way that the original discovery of the antibiotic properties of penicillin was neglected, resting in the files waiting to be pulled out and understood for what it is, the only ultimate answer to the hard, cruel fact of the bomb. To Curtis LeMay's "The bombers always get through," and William Borden's "There will be no time." I mean the Acheson-Lilienthal report that Oppenheimer in 1946 guided his 4 colleagues on Acheson's panel of experts to prepare. Los Alamos Laboratory Associate Director John Manley once commented sardonically that, quite contrary to the way I thought things were in Washington, you don't do staff work and then make a decision. You make a decision and then do the staff work. In the curious way of government reports, the Acheson-Lilienthal report originated in the Truman administration's late 1945 agreed declaration with Britain and Canada to prevent the use of atomic energy for destructive purposes and to promote the utilization of atomic energy for peaceful and humanitarian ends. Such action required a plan. Jimmy Burns, as Secretary of State, got the job of devising it. Burns appointed a protesting Dean Acheson to be chairman of a committee that included the head of the Manhattan Project, General Groves, Vannevar Bush, James Conant, and John J. McCloy. Acheson in turn appointed a 5-man expert panel. David Lilienthal, chairman of the TVA, chaired it. And besides Oppenheimer, it included Monsanto chemist Charles Thomas, General Electric engineer Harry Wynne, and Chester Barnard, not exactly a bunch of wild-eyed internationalists. Oppenheimer came prepared. He had explored the complexities of international control, not only with the Danish Nobel laureate physicist Niels Bohr at Los Alamos and with Conant, but also with Rabi. Oppenheimer and I met frequently, Rabi said later, and discussed these questions thoroughly. Once Oppenheimer got interested in something, he went right on to become the leader of it. Gordon Arneson, the State Department's specialist on atomic matters, says Oppenheimer became the chief teacher for the Acheson-Lilienthal group. The men met first in Washington. Oppenheimer gave them a 10-day course in nuclear physics, properly taking control as the only real expert of defining the technical basis of the problem. But other than serving as their savant, he kept his own counsel at first. They moved next to New York to talk to a group of scientists, including Berkeley physicist Louis Alvarez, who had explored for General Groves a scheme of control by inspection alone, involving what we would now call national technical means. Discussion intensified. Ideas came from every side. These were men of diverse background and conviction, and they debated them night and day. When patience gave way to exasperation and someone proposed simply outlawing the bomb, which happened frequently, Lilienthal always waved a newspaper clipping about the agreed declaration to remind them that their government had already committed itself to international control. Back to Washington to study geology. They made progress. Then they got seriously stuck. Lilienthal proposed they tour Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, whiskey on the train down to Knoxville, and a hungover tour of the vast gaseous diffusion plant where supervisors prowled among the surreal piping on bicycles warmed their friendship. They flew to Los Alamos in General Groves's personal C-54. The president was trying to reach Lilienthal to offer him a cabinet post as Secretary of the Interior, the TV chairman wrongly thought. But not even that provocation dulled him to the significance of the secret mesa, as he wrote, forming a majestic backdrop, where they went into casual little buildings, saw things only few men have seen, talked with soft-spoken, gentle, intelligent men about the things they had done. Now I have a sense, Lilienthal concluded, that this thing of atomic bombs is real. Herb Marks, Atchison's personal representative of the panel, who accompanied the men on their travels, caught the mood and a whiff of the essence of the problem. It wasn't a large place, he wrote of the building on the hill where they examined the unassembled components of the few bombs yet in the stockpile. And it wasn't a spectacular one. I looked around me and there were the same materials, colors, textures, and fabrics you might see in any warehouse. I saw the receptacles that contained the labor of God knows how many men, the cargoes of thousands of freight cars, the mental triumphs of gifted scientists born in a dozen countries. The receptacles were small, and I thought to myself, hell, I could walk out of here with one of them in my pocket. Not that I could have. Too many soldiers outside and inside the vault were watching us closely, tough troops who looked as though they kept their rifles cleaned. Supposing I had got away with one, what could I, an ordinary layman, have done with it? In a way, Marx concludes, the same was true of so much of the whole Manhattan district. It bore no relation to the industrial or social life of the country. It was a separate state with its own airplanes and its own factories and its thousands of secrets. It had a peculiar sovereignty, one that could bring about the end peacefully or violently of all other sovereignties. What that panel of hard-eyed practical men came to was a radical proposal. Remarkably, it won their common agreement. When Niels Bohr read it, he wrote Oppenheimer of his deep pleasure. In every word of it, he said, he found just the spirit which I think offers the best hopes for the development in which we all put our whole faith. Many of you probably know what was in that report, though I wonder every time I reread it if anyone in authority ever quite grasped the full import of its argument. It was nothing less than an argument for nuclear abolition when no more than a few bombs had yet been built, anticipating the nuclear arms race and all its near misses over the years, and understanding that the bombers or the missiles always get through. Any system, it argued, based on outlawing the purely military development of atomic energy and relying solely on inspection for enforcement, would at the outset be surrounded by conditions which would destroy the system. To the contrary, every stage in the activity leading from raw materials to weapons needs some sort of control. If, for example, a putative International Atomic Development Authority were the only entity that could legally own and process uranium ore, then not the purpose of those who mine or possess uranium ore, but the mere fact of their mining or possessing it becomes illegal, and national violation is an unambiguous signal of warlike purposes. The very opening of a mine by anyone other than the international agency is a red light without more. It is not necessary to wait for evidence that the product of that mine is going to be misused. And if the authority spreads its mines and factories and laboratories and reactors around the world so that their benefits could be shared, then the real protection will lie in the fact that if any nation seizes the plants or the stockpiles that are situated in its territory, other nations will have similar facilities and materials situated within their own borders, so that the act of seizure need not place them at a disadvantage. This remarkable idea, spreading the intrinsically dangerous mines and factories around, is indistinguishable from what has come to be called nuclear proliferation, except that the agent of proliferation in the Acheson-Lilienthal reports would have been an organ of the United Nations rather than individual states. And the technology that proliferated would have been infrastructure alone rather than infrastructure and stockpiled weapons. Though the report does not belabor the point, it notes more than once that true security is incompatible with secrecy. Its proposal for a radical system of self-policing makes starkly clear what the condition that Niels Bohr had called an open world would be. A world where how to design atomic bombs might be public knowledge, as it has come to some extent to be. A world, as it were, where the guns had all been laid out together in the open on a table, but disassembled and arranged so as to be within everyone's equal reach. Would it have worked? In a much more unstable and dangerous form as state-sponsored nuclear proliferation, it did and does. It would work without warheads and weapons in a world with much greater transparency than presently obtains. We are moving rapidly toward that transparency anyway, as new technologies penetrate privacy and secrets are swept away. It's no great prediction to say that by 2050, the only privacy that will be left in the world will be the privacy we legislate for ourselves. Oppenheimer and his colleagues' far-sighted proposal may have been premature. Certainly the Soviet Union had no intention of abrogating atomic arms until it knew how to build them. Bernard Baruch, who modified the Acheson-Lilienthal report into his Baruch plan to present to the United Nations, missed the point completely when he complained that the report did not deal with the problem of enforcement. Enforcement, of course, is what the report's red light was about. A move to commandeer any part of the nuclear infrastructure would be an act of war, to which other nations might respond accordingly. Not understanding, Baruch added a clause promising swift and sure enforcement and demanded that the Security Council give up his veto authority in atomic matters, guaranteed the rejection of his version of the plan. Oppenheimer, observing that the United Nations was hardly the place to forge agreement on the highest matters of national security policy, judged shrewdly and probably correctly that his government was not serious in any case about international control. Oppenheimer chaired one more panel on disarmament for Dean Acheson in 1952. Vannevar Bush and Alan Dulles sat among its members. McGeorge Bundy served as secretary and rapporteur, once again experienced and sober men for whom only a paranoid could imagine that Oppenheimer might serve as a Svengali. As had the Acheson-Lilienthal report, Oppenheimer's panel also came to a conclusion about the new knowledge of how to release nuclear energy that is as valid today as it was then, and as inescapably final. Fundamentally, and in the long run, the report concluded, the problem which is posed by the release of atomic energy is a problem of the ability of the human race to govern itself without war. There is no permanent method of excising atomic energy from our affairs now that men know how it can be released. Even if some reasonably complete international control of atomic energy should be established, the report continues, knowledge would persist, and it is hard to see how there could be any major war in which one side or another would not eventually make use of atomic bombs. In this respect, the problem of armaments was permanently and drastically altered in 1945. Nuclear weapons, made supposedly more usable and therefore credibly deterrent with lower yields, will not solve the problem, nor will bunker busters, nor will missile defenses, nor will preemptive wars. Only the deterrence of knowledge in an open world, which means, practically speaking, nothing more utopian than delivery times from mothballed factory to target of 3 months, rather than delivery times from silo to target of 30 minutes. Only the deterrence of knowledge without stockpiles will buy the world the space it needs to come to its senses or act in concert whenever an entity bent on domination attempts to violate the ban. Which is another way of saying that the problem will never go away. Of course it won't. Knowledge of how to release nuclear energy is new knowledge of the natural world, to which the human world has no choice but to adapt or be destroyed. Just as knowledge of global warming is new knowledge of the natural world, just as knowledge of smallpox and polio and COVID-19 are new knowledge of the natural world. With Bohr, Oppenheimer understood that truth, and it was a deeper understanding than theoretical physics, original and profound. I take exception to the portrait of Robert Oppenheimer as having made a Faustian bargain, a deal with the devil, in leading the wartime laboratory that developed the first atomic bombs. The British and American race to build the first atomic bombs was predicated on the assumption that Nazi Germany was racing to the same end. Had first-class physicists like Werner Heisenberg committed to the task, and had at least a year's head start. The assumption may have been wrong, as it turned out to be. The German atomic bomb program took an early wrong turn toward building a nuclear reactor and never recovered from its mistake. But that was not a gamble we were prepared to risk. Recall that many of the scientists urging the US government to develop the bomb were Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, keenly aware of the kind of genocidal state Germany had become under Adolf Hitler. The prospect of a Third Reich with atomic bombs was intolerable. Among the records of the Nazi SS I studied for my book on the SS Einsatzgruppen, Masters of Death, were plans to continue the Holocaust into Britain, the United States, and the rest of the world, to kill not 6 million Jews, but 20 million, to the last man, woman, and child. Racing for the bomb was not a Faustian bargain, nor was it a message of threat to the Russians. It was an act of desperation, accorded the highest priority of any military project of the Second World War. When Oppenheimer recruited the men and women he needed for his secret laboratory at Los Alamos, where the actual bombs would be designed, built, and tested, he was not free to tell them what work he needed them to do. Instead, as he walked with them on university campuses all over America, he told them something he believed to be true that he hoped would be persuasive. "I can't tell you what work we'll be doing," he said in so many words, "but I can tell you that it may end this war, and it may end all wars." That was what Bohr meant when he wrote Oppenheimer his approval of the Acheson-Lilienthal plan. Bohr said later, "We are in an entirely new situation that cannot be resolved by war." As for Robert Oppenheimer and his complexities, I prefer to remember the far-sighted and deeply felt talk he gave at Los Alamos as the wartime staff was preparing to depart, to return to their civilian lives early in November 1945, with a great storm blowing up outside to punctuate his words. I will quote at some length. In considering what the situation of science is, Oppenheimer said that night, 75 years ago, it may be helpful to think a little of what people said and felt of their motives in coming into this job. One always has to worry that what people say of their motives is not adequate. Many people said different things, and most of them, I think, had some validity. There was, in the first place, the great concern that our enemy might develop these weapons before we did. And the feeling, at least in the early days, the very strong feeling, that without atomic weapons, it might be very difficult. It might be impossible. It might be an incredibly long thing to win the war. These things wore off a little as it became clear that the war would be won in any case. Some people, I think, were motivated by curiosity, and rightly so. Some by a sense of adventure, and rightly so. Others had more political arguments and said, well, we know that atomic weapons are in principle possible, and it's not right that the threat of their unrealized possibility should hang over the world. It's right that the world should know what can be done in this field and deal with it. And the people added to that it was a time when all over the world, men would be particularly ripe and open for dealing with this problem because of the immediacy of the evils of war, because of the universal cry from everyone that one could not go through this thing again, even a war without atomic bombs. And there was finally, and I think rightly, the feeling that there was probably no place in the world where the development of atomic weapons would have a better chance of leading to a reasonable solution and a smaller chance of leading to disaster than within the United States. I believe all these things that people said are true, and I think I said them all myself at one time or another. But when you come right down to it, Oppenheimer continued, the reason that we did this job is because it was an organic necessity. If you are a scientist, you cannot stop such a thing. If you are a scientist, you believe that it is good to find out how the world works, that it is good to find out what the realities are, that it is good to turn over to mankind at large the greatest possible power to control the world and to deal with it according to its lights and its values. It's not possible to be a scientist, Oppenheimer continued a little later, unless you believe that it is good to learn. It's not possible to be a scientist unless you think that it is of the highest value to share your knowledge, to share it with anyone who is interested. It's not possible to be a scientist unless you believe that the knowledge of the world and the power which this gives is a thing which is of intrinsic value to humanity, and that you are using it to help in the spread of knowledge and are willing to take the consequences. There are many people, Oppenheimer went on, who try to wiggle out of this. They say the real importance of atomic energy does not lie in the weapons that have been made. The real importance lies in all the great benefits which atomic energy will bring to mankind. There may be some truth in this. I am sure that there is truth in it because there never has in the past been a new field opened up where the real fruits of it have not been invisible at the beginning. I have a very high confidence that the fruits, the so-called peacetime applications of atomic energy, will have in them all that we think and more. There are others who try to escape the immediacy of this situation by saying that, after all, war has always been terrible. After all, weapons have always gotten worse and worse, that this is just another weapon and it doesn't create a great change, that they are not so bad. Bombings have been bad in this war, and this is not a change in that. It just adds a little to the effectiveness of the bombing, that some sort of protection will be found. I think that these efforts to diffuse and weaken the nature of the crisis makes it only more dangerous. I think it is for us to accept it as a very grave crisis, to realize that these atomic weapons, which we have started to make, are very terrible, that they involve a change, that they are not just a slight modification. To accept this and to accept with it the necessity for those transformations in the world which will make it possible to integrate these developments into human life. It is clear to me, Oppenheimer told his Los Alamos comrades, that wars have changed. It is clear to me that these first bombs, the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, that if these can destroy 10 square miles, then that it is really quite something. It is clear to me that they are going to be very cheap if anyone wants to make them. It is clear to me that this is a situation where a quantitative change and a change in which the advantage of attack compared to defense is shifted, where this quantitative change has all the character of a change in quality, of a change in the nature of the world. I know that wars have become intolerable, and the question would have been pursued after this war more ardently than after the last, of whether there was not some method by which they could be averted. But I think the advent of the atomic bomb and the facts which will get around that they are not too hard to make, that they will be universal if people wish to make them universal, that they will not constitute a real drain on the economy of any strong nation, and that their power of destruction will grow and is already incomparably greater than that of any other weapon. I think these things create a new situation, so new that there is some danger in believing that what we have is a new argument for hopes that existed before this development took place. By that I mean that much as I like to hear advocates of a world federation or advocates of a United Nations organization say that here is a new argument, I think that they are in part missing the point. Because the point is not that atomic weapons constitute a new argument. There have always been good arguments. The point is that atomic weapons constitute also a new field and a new opportunity of realizing, of beginning to realize those changes which are needed if there is to be any peace. These are very far-reaching changes. They are changes in the relations between nations, not only in spirit, not only in law, but also in conception and feeling. I don't know which of these is prior. They must all work together, and only the gradual interaction of one on the other can make a reality. I don't agree with those who say the first step is to have a structure of international law. I don't agree with those who say the only thing is to have friendly feelings. All of these things will be involved. I think it is true to say that atomic weapons are a peril which affects everyone in the world, and in that sense, a completely common problem, as common a problem as it was for the Allies to defeat the Nazis. I think that in order to handle this common problem, there must be a complete sense of community responsibility. It is a new field, Oppenheimer continued as the storm blew across the mesa, in which just the novelty and the special characteristics of the technical operations should enable one to establish a community of interest which might almost be regarded as a pilot plant for a new type of international collaboration. I speak of it as a pilot plant because it is quite clear that the control of atomic weapons cannot be in itself the unique end of such operation. The only unique end can be a world that is united and a world in which war will not occur. Now, this is not an easy thing. And the one point I want to hammer home is what an enormous change in spirit is involved. There are things which we hold very dear, and I think rightly hold very dear. I would say that the word democracy perhaps stood for some of them as well as any other word. There are many parts of the world in which there is no democracy. There are other things which we hold dear and which we rightly should. And when I speak of a new spirit in international affairs, I mean that even to these deepest of things which we cherish and for which Americans have been willing to die, even in these deepest things, we realize that there is something more profound than that, namely the common bond with other men everywhere. It is only if you cherish that this makes sense. Because if you approach the problem and say, we know what is right, and we would like to use the atomic bomb to persuade you to agree with us, then you are in a very weak position and you will not succeed. You will find yourselves attempting by force of arms to prevent a disaster. And finally, from a commencement speech Oppenheimer delivered in 1946. The atomic bomb was the turn of the screw. It made the prospect of future war unendurable. It has led us up those last steps to the mountain pass, and beyond, there is a different country. Robert Oppenheimer had learned all that by 1946. I'm sorry to say that the rest of us, our politicians, our military, our leaders, the other nuclear powers, have not learned it yet, 15 years later, to our continuing peril. I hope we will. I have to believe that we will. Thank you. So, I'd be happy to take questions.
The first one, Mr. Rhodes, is why have Oppenheimer's FBI files never been published in a single book, similar to the transcripts of his security clearance inquiry? The volume of documents alone would be interesting. So that's the first question.
Yes, the volume of documents would represent a library shelf or two if you tried to publish them. And I have to say, I don't know if you've seen raw FBI files, but they're really not terribly, what can I call it, really not very terribly organized. They're kind of thrown together based on what information was made available. And they're not in any way edited or adjudicated or what's the latest word, curated. They really are raw, and I don't think they'd really be of much value. They should perhaps be put online, and to the best of my knowledge, they have not been. That would be a better way, I think, for anyone who wanted to look through them to access them. There you could see, as I found when I went through some of them at the National Archives, I found a letter from Edward Teller to the FBI describing Oppenheimer as having had a mental illness when he was young and other such scurrilous statements. I was not allowed to make a copy of the document, so I sat down with a little portable typewriter I had in those pre-computer days. This was in the early 80s, and typed out the document and sent it to Los Alamos, which I gather got Teller into considerable trouble with his colleagues there. Many of them refused to speak to him after that. So the documents are simply too voluminous, but I do think they might well be put online. It would be fascinating to go through them in that way.
Great, thank you. Another question is, were there any particular scientists that Oppenheimer admired? Do you know of any women scientists that worked on the project?
There were a couple of women scientists who worked not at Los Alamos, as far as I know, but elsewhere in the project. one of whom later was a Nobel laureate, and I'm forgetting her name, I apologize. But I think Oppenheimer admired her. In fact, I'm quite sure he did. But in the nature of things, there weren't very many, and a war was on, and men were still very much dominating all the, you noticed Oppenheimer spoke of men rather than people. That was still an era when women were greatly shorted in their capacities. What did happen, however, is that here were all these families of scientists stuck on the mesa at Los Alamos, fenced in with barbed wire and not allowed to go anywhere until late in the war, when a few were allowed to go into Santa Fe for an evening to have a drink and dinner. But most of the war, they were simply there. And there were two activities that were extremely intensive during the war period. One, a lot of babies were born. There was one time when General Groves asked the doctor who was on staff there to do something about all these babies. And the doctor said, my authority doesn't stretch that far, General Groves. But many of the women were well-educated and often scientists themselves. And they were put to work as what were called computers. That is to say, with Marchand calculators on desks. They worked on the calculations of the hydrodynamics of an implosion and things like that in order to produce the kind of complex material or data that would have been later done by a computer. And in fact, Dick Feynman was in charge of that whole operation, and very quickly realized that if they used IBM card sorting machines, which were of course not computers, but they did sort punch cards according to what was punched on the cards, that if they used them in a kind of sequential fashion, they could do calculations on the rapid calculations on IBM card sorters. So they would take a stack of cards and punch them with a question, as it were, and put them into a card sorter, and it would run through the deck, and then they'd take the cards that it pulled and put them in the next place, and onward and upward. But that's the problem with asking about the women in the project. There simply weren't very many who were assigned to actually work on the weapons.
Thank you. Another question, does Oppenheimer have any descendants, either family members, people who have studied under him or under people who knew him well, who can speak credibly to his values, perspectives, etc., and try to help preserve his legacy?
Yes, Oppenheimer's grandchildren are very much around. I think one of his grandsons live in the San Francisco area where I live. Oppenheimer's son, perhaps a little background is worthwhile here. Oppenheimer married a really complicated woman named Kitty, who was of German descent, had previously been married to one of the young men who fought on the side of the rebels in the Spanish Civil War and was killed in the Spanish Civil War. Kitty then moved out to Berkeley and fell in love with Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer, she divorced a man she had then married and married him and was his wife through the rest of his life. And she was an alcoholic. She was a very difficult woman. Many people said she was absolutely impossible to be around. I asked Hans Bethe, who was one of the most equitable human beings you can imagine, who simply, I just never saw him be unpleasant to anybody. And I think his reputation was as someone who was generous and decent and very mentally healthy as a human being. And I said to him, was Kitty Oppenheimer as difficult a person as people say? And without pausing, and so uncharacteristically, Bethe said to me, Kitty was a bitch. And I just was startled by this, his description of Kitty Oppenheimer. So it made for a very difficult time at Los Alamos, and one of the casualties were their two children. Oppenheimer and Kitty Oppenheimer's daughter committed suicide as a young woman, And her son is still living a quiet life somewhere in the New Mexico area. He became a carpenter. He was a recluse. I saw him once at a distance and we sort of waved at each other, and that's as close as I ever got to him. So there are family people around, but I think Oppenheimer's legacy really is now represented by the scientists whom he influenced, by the historians who have written his biography and have followed him there. And if for anyone who wants to look it up, by the writing he did. He wrote some wonderful essays in the course of his life. He was an extraordinarily accomplished prose stylist. He was a wonderful writer. And I wish he had written the history of the project. It would have been a stellar thing indeed. But he was busy through the early 1950s being an advisor to the government, hoping he could shape nuclear policy. And then with the awful, awful security hearing, he really was a broken man afterwards. It just devastated him. All of his insecurities as a human being, all of his feeling of self-loathing that others described in him simply was crushed by this concerted effort to destroy him that lifted his security clearance and basically threw him out of government ever after. He became the director at the Institute for Advanced Research in Princeton, New Jersey, for the rest of his career. And then during that time, since he was a chain smoker, developed cancer of the lungs and of the throat, actually, and was treated with intense radiation therapy that caused the cancer to become worse in the long run. He was basically killed with radiation, which is a sadly ironic part of the story. But people didn't know in the 1950s about how much radiation to use to treat cancer. So it was that kind of a sad story.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The next question, you interviewed so many prolific figures for your book. What was that like, and any big surprises from your conversations with those people?
They were eager to be interviewed. There had not, when I started my book, been any really complete book about the Manhattan Project. There was Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, which was written by a German journalist, which was all built around interviews because the documentation that one really needed to tell the story in a more complete way had not yet been declassified. I was very lucky when I thought I should try to write this book. These documents had just been declassified, and I was able to go to the places where they were stored and look at them and develop a much deeper impression of what happened. Some of the people I interviewed said afterwards that I had the dates and the facts more accurate than they remembered them. So I think the documentation was very important. But I still tried to interview everyone I could. And just to give you 2 or maybe 3 stories about some of those interviews to get a sense of the flavor. I didn't get to interview Dick Feynman face to face, but I did interview him by telephone. And one of the things I asked him, because I knew he had been grieving for his wife who died of tuberculosis just before the Trinity test that we're marking today, and had spent the following year kind of in a funk, teaching at, I think Cornell, but not really able to get back into physics yet. I asked him what he thought in those months and weeks after the war about where the world was, because there was such a sense among the nuclear scientists that these bombs were going to be developed internationally, and that inevitably there would be a nuclear arms race, and that inevitably it would lead to a nuclear war. So they were desperate to move towards some kind of international control system. That's really what Oppenheimer was talking about in the passages I read from his speech at Los Alamos before they all dispersed. So Feynman, when I asked him about what he was thinking about at that time, said, well, you know, I was sitting in a bar one day in Times Square. He hung out in bars to pick up women. That was his hobby in those years after his wife died. He was a very good looking guy. he said, I was looking out over the people all milling around in Times Square, and I thought to myself, you poor souls, you have no idea that in a couple more years, you're all going to be dead. And I thought, well, I can take that to the bank. Thank you very much. And really very little of what else we talked about do I vividly remember. It was such a stark and pointed story. Then there was interviewing Dr. Teller. Dr. Teller, by then, this was 1983, perhaps 82, Teller had been interviewed enough that he was wary of interviewers. He was sure everyone was out to get him. And he had concluded that that the secret of how they got him was to cut an interview into smaller pieces and only use the pieces that connect them together in a way that would make him look bad. So he had decided that with interviews, first of all, you had to basically audition for an interview with Teller by giving him some information about yourself that would convince him that he should even be in the same room with you. And then he, at least for people who were interviewing for broadcast purposes, he would give them exactly the number of minutes. He would say, how long will this actually be on the air? What will be the actual airtime? And if they said 3 minutes, he said, very well, you may interview me for 3 minutes and no more. So he figured they couldn't cut that. I was interviewed another wonderful figure in the Manhattan Project, not as well known as Teller, and that was Emilio Segre, who was an Italian Nobel laureate who had worked with Fermi in Rome and then later had joined the project, had won his Nobel for discovering the element technetium, and who was celebrated for being a really waspish wit. So when I told him I was from his place in Northern California, I was going next to interview Dr. Teller because I did finally get my foot in the door with Teller. He said, oh, I can tell you how you should interview a Dr. Teller. All you have to do is say, Dr. Teller, I believe you are a god. And then Dr. Teller will talk to you. So armed with that information, I went to Teller's house, which was on the Stanford campus back in the kind of woods behind the main part of the campus, because Teller had been so harassed at Berkeley, where he had been before. They had threatened to burn down his house, poor man, the students. And he had decided he had to move someplace safe, so he switched over to Stanford. I went in and Mitzi Teller, who was the tiny little Hungarian woman, was there seated with a cup of coffee, looking very much as if she wished she'd had a bag of popcorn to watch this interview. In any case, Teller had read one of my collections of magazine articles that I had written that I had sent him and had landed on a very satiric piece I'd written about Gerald Ford. And he was livid about it. He said, Gerald Ford is a wonderful man. You've made him look like a terrible human being. How dare you, and so forth. And at one point he raised his book my book over his head, and I thought he was going to hit me with his book. And I remember thinking briefly, oh, I can take him. He's 70 years old. I was a good deal younger then than I am now. But he said 3 questions. That's all I'll let you ask. And the first one I asked him was Robert Oppenheimer as fine a laboratory director as everyone said? And lo and behold, and I think I just quoted this in my lecture, Teller said, Dr. Oppenheimer was the finest lab director I have ever known. And I thought, if that's all I get, that's more than enough. And I put that, of course, in the book. And another question or so, and then it was out the door with him almost chasing me out the front door. I went up to a friend's house in Bolinas and got drunk. I was so shaken by this encounter with Edward Teller. So that's some of the kinds. One other story. This refers to the documents rather than the people. I went to Berlin, to Dahlem, a suburb of Berlin, to visit the library where the correspondence between Lisa Meitner and Otto Hahn, the two of the three co-discoverers of nuclear fission was kept. And I asked to see the letter that Meitner had written to Hahn when Hahn wrote her telling her about this strange new reaction they had discovered by bombarding a solution of uranium nitrate with neutrons and finding barium in the mixture, which, what was barium doing there? Barium's atomic weight was like half of uranium's. It didn't belong there. How did it get there? He said, we're chemists, we're not physicists, we don't understand this. And she wrote back, and this is all in German, and I read a little German, so, but she wrote back and said, a very strange and interesting burst, she called it. Later on, she and her nephew, Otto Frisch, went walking. They were staying in a little village in Western Sweden at Christmas time, went walking in the snow and worked out the energetics using E equals mc squared as their basic formula for just how much energy would come out of even one fission of a uranium atom. But I teared up when I read that letter because I realized I was holding in my hands one of the most historic documents of all time, the discovery of a new way to release for the first time energy that was not produced directly or indirectly by sunlight, other than, of course, well, no, water power is true. That here was the actual document that led to all that followed from it up to this day. Those were some of the experiences, and if you don't look at the documents, if you can, talk to the people, if you don't visit the sites, I think as an historian, you don't get the depth of feeling that you need in order to tell with passion and commitment a story of this richness and complexity.
Thank you. I think we're going to do a couple more. One question, do you have a perspective on how we might bring China at a minimum into the New START Treaty to continue driving global nuclear weapons numbers downward?
Well, we might start by not rejecting China in every way that our Secretary of State can think of. China is rapidly becoming the new Cold War center, which I remember back in '93 when Dick Cheney became Secretary of Defense. Cheney was scratching around looking for a way to draw China in as the new Cold War because he thought we needed a good Cold War to keep the industry going. We didn't get it, fortunately, at least not quite in the same form it had been before. But there certainly is a movement and part of the right today in America to try to turn China into the new enemy. And it might be a better way to find ways to work in common, as Oppenheimer put it, to make common purpose with the Chinese. You know, it's interesting about the Chinese nuclear program. They learned from a British scientist who was part of the Manhattan Project the idea that minimum deterrence was all you really needed. You didn't have to build a giant arsenal of nuclear weapons. In fact, it was a waste of money. All you needed was enough weapons to be credible as a nuclear opponent, meaning enough basically that a few would be left if you were attacked. And for most of the years up to recently, China only had 20 ICBMs. They never saw the point in spending all their money building a huge stockpile of such weapons. And the truth is, there is no point. As long as you're sure you have a deliverable second strike, you don't really need all the rest. The rest in the United States have been basically parasitic. Parasite defined as something that takes from you and gives you nothing back. And it's been largely because, of course, basic fear of the Soviet Union. But then why have we continued after the Cold War ended? We have because there's a huge industry involved, because the three military branches have all been at war with each other about allotments, about how much money they get in their budget for the nuclear part. I don't know if people realize it, but after the war, the US Air Force realized that if it could corner the market, as it were, on controlling the nuclear arsenal, that it could control most of the defense budget. And by the mid-1950s, when the Army and the Air Force did not yet have much in the way of nuclear weapons, if anything at all, the Air Force had managed to squeeze out 47% of the defense budget on the grounds that it could take care of everything. All it would do is fly over Eastern Europe, bomb all the countries in Eastern Europe, then bomb the Soviet Union, then fly on over to China and bomb China. That was the master plan. And for that, they needed all the bombs and the biggest possible bombs. Curtis LeMay and his B-29s, and then his B-47s, and then his B-52s could take care of it all. And when the rest of the military branches realized what was going on, they decided they needed nuclear weapons as well. And suddenly the Army had a purpose for nuclear cannons and small nuclear weapons that could be used in the battlefield. And the Navy needed nuclear weapons to develop the nuclear submarine and for depth charges and so forth. And off they went. And we ended up at the end with something like 70,000 nuclear weapons. We're now down to about 13,000. The estimate of the most recent models of nuclear winter, which is global freezing at a level that would basically starve out a couple billion people around the world. The latest estimate of how many nuclear explosions over cities it would take is about fewer than 100. So we have a doomsday machine, whether we like it or not. Or as Gorbachev told Ronald Reagan at Reykjavik, look, I wouldn't need to explode my nuclear weapons over your country. We could just explode them over in the Soviet Union, and the fallout and whatever would kill you as well as us. So what are they for, he said, and he proposed that they move to minimal deterrence in the direction of moving toward the elimination of nuclear weapons, which unfortunately President Reagan wasn't able to agree to because he was convinced that people would cheat on treaties, even if the treaty was to their advantage, and that therefore you needed some kind of strategic defense initiative to defend your country. And on that grounds, the two were unable to agree. But they really did begin the process that was one of the things that led to the end of the Cold War. So it was not all wasted at Reykjavik, but that's why we have so many, in my opinion, after 40 years of studying the subject. And that's why there's a lot of room for us to work toward reductions, to work toward even elimination.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question, and then I think we might stop.
Okay. I'm going to combine the two together because the first one's rather short. Do you plan on publishing anything on your perception of Robert Oppenheimer? Are you looking at possibly publishing anything on him?
You know, I always wanted to do a biography of Oppenheimer, but I think at this point in time, it's really not in my plans. The big biography that was done by two historians that won a Pulitzer Prize in biography is there. As a fellow writer and therefore competitive, I don't think it captured some of the real depth of Oppenheimer's character. But if you read those two volumes, and then you read Priscilla Macmillan's brilliant book, The Ruin of J. Robert Oppenheimer, I think you've got the man among those volumes and really don't need another. I've moved over in the direction of energy, like my last book, and I'm currently working on a biography of an old friend who I've wanted to write a biography of for many years, and that's Edward O. Wilson, the biologist and entomologist who has become kind of almost a Jane Goodall figure in his pursuit of trying to save what's left of the wilderness in the world at a time when wilderness is being destroyed at a very rapid pace. Ed sees that it's possible given all the resources that the nations have, to set aside enough wilderness to keep that aspect of human experience and of the natural world living, rather than simply paving over the planet as we've sort of been doing for the last 200 years. And he's himself a fascinating figure as a really towering scientist, in some ways the logical and natural heir to Charles Darwin. So it's great fun to work with him. As I said, he's an old friend. I've known him for about 30 years, and we've always said we wanted to do a biography together, and he's now 91, and I realized I'd better get going. And I'm 83, so I better get going. And I'm about halfway through that book right now.
So thank you again so much, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Mr. Rhodes, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all. My pleasure.